Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club on this first lunch hour since the presentation of the budget. We hope you enjoyed your wine. The Treasurer, Mr. Keating, is making his second appearance in this post-budget role at the club. It might be worth just reminding you that although he's now so familiar to you as Treasurer, this is his second post in government. He managed to get 3 weeks' experience in the ministry in 1975 before preparing himself for this role. Not long enough, he says. This post-budget lunch has become something of a tradition. I'm glad to see that in a period of change the audience today indicates that at least the budget hasn't lost its position as a centre of interest in political affairs in this city. Mr. Keating is slightly constrained for time today because Parliament resumes at 2 o'clock and he's expected to be there, obviously, today for questions. He'll have to leave here a few minutes before that, and we're starting a little later than usual because of the pressure from the other end of the lunch hour on broadcasting time caused by parliamentary sitting arrangements. So when we get to questions, I hope we can deal with them as far as the questioners are concerned in as concise a fashion as possible, and we'll try and get as many people through as we can. I'm happy to introduce to you the Treasurer, Mr. Paul Keating.
Ken, Mr. President, thank you very much for the opportunity to address the members of the National Press Club once again on the occasion of the presentation of the budget. I might add that before I left Parliament House we had a blackout and I lost the speech on the word processor, so I'm taking this one on trust. Not that that's a quality I'm over-imbued with, but I'm persevering anyway. The last time I came before you, of course, it was in vastly different circumstances than 12 months ago. Back then, the economic strategy adopted by the Hawke Labor government was still subject to debate and challenge, despite the substantial agreement reached at the National Economic Summit. Many people thought the fiscal stance we adopted for 1983-4 was too timid. Others were critical of us for expanding Commonwealth spending too much. In the event, Mr. President, the policy mix we adopted did, I think, prove to be the far best for Australia, the best possible outcome for Australia at the time. That fact has certainly been recognised by independent commentators. Now, every now and again there's a quote turns up that ministers and treasurers really stick to. And there was one last week in the Westpac Banking Corporation's economic review which said this, and the quote is, "Despite much initial scepticism, the 1983-4 budget mixture was the correct policy prescription to help turn the economy around. The results speak for themselves." Very well put, I thought. Mr. President, let me now outline in more detail the economic outlook for this year. We expect that employment will expand by about 150,000 over the year to June, which will bring growth since April 1983 to about 410,000. That will bring us well within reach of our target of creating 500,000 new jobs in our first 3 years of office. In general, the broadening in the pattern of demand evident in the second half of 1983-4 is expected to underpin the strong growth in activity forecast for 1984-5. Another strong rise in employment and declining inflation should boost consumer confidence, which, along with the tax cut, should see further firm growth in private consumption. In the business area, members may recall that a turnaround in company investment was one of the highlights revealed in the recent economic statistics. With strong profits growth and expanding demand, business investment is expected to accelerate further over the course of 1984-5, with the eventual result being a real increase of 5% when compared with the whole of 1983-4. Taking spending on plant and equipment alone, the increase between the June quarter 1984 and the June quarter 1985 is expected to be around 9%. Last financial year, a turnaround in the stock cycle made a major contribution to economic growth. Firms reacted to the much better economic climate under Labor, first by stopping their stocks from running down then by beginning to build up their stock levels in anticipation of better times. That restocking phase is forecast to continue this financial year, and its contribution to overall growth is expected to be even more than the 1% of GDP it counted for last year. Aside from all those factors, public sector spending is again expected to add considerably to the economy's overall growth rate. Of course, all of these forecasts are dependent on the soundly based assumption that the successful price and incomes accord with the unions will continue to operate as well as it has to date. The accord is the centrepiece of this government's economic strategy. It was the accord and our relationship with the ACTU that allowed us last financial year to use a sizable budget deficit to stimulate the economy, and without fear of rekindling inflationary pressures, pull Australia out of its deep malaise. And it is the accord that will allow us this financial year to embark upon a new growth path without resurrecting the old threat of yet another destructive price and wages round. In the past, each time the prospect of improved economic growth has emerged, it has been dashed by the seemingly inevitable cycle of excessive wage demands and hefty price rises. This time, Australia has the opportunity to overturn that historical pattern. We make no apology for taking that opportunity, and we make no apology for including in this budget the large tax cuts which will ensure the Australian community will take that opportunity. Mr President, the tax cuts which will assist in securing moderation in the pay demands of the Australian workforce are money well spent. For business, the tax cuts will ensure that companies will not have to make any wage increase under indexation between April this year and April next year. They will also provide the stimulus needed to boost consumer spending, which is so vital to business and the continuation of the economic recovery. I make no secret of the fact that the retail sales component of private consumption has been one of the weak spots in the economy, and it is important we do something to ensure a pick-up in that area of activity. Of course, the tax cuts also contain a very important redistributive element. They are directly targeted to the lower and middle income workers. The government then sees the tax cuts announced in the budget as performing three roles: assisting in the maintenance of the accord, stimulating consumer demand and restoring equity and fairness to the tax system. Mr President, let me make it absolutely clear that these are real tax cuts. I notice that the opposition have attempted to mislead people in this regard and seem to have also misled some commentators about this fact. The 23% increase in individual income tax receipts contained in this budget is a totally misleading figure if discussed in the context of the tax burden. The Medicare arrangements, which merely channel health insurance costs through a new route, account for 5.5 percentage points of this increase. That brings us back to 17.5. The full year effect of the prescribed payment system accounts for another half a point. That is a benefit from reducing tax avoidance, particularly in the building and transport industries. A third major factor is the strong increase in tax collected from business taxpayers and farmers. From a low base, these taxpayers have enjoyed a dramatic increase in earnings with the recovery and the breaking of the drought. Taking out these three extraordinary factors, we are left with the increase in tax on ordinary salary and wage earners. Gross pay-as-you-earn tax, that is, the amounts deducted from wages each week or fortnight, are forecast to grow by only 10.7%. Now, that increase is virtually identical to the compound growth in average earnings and employment expected this year. Or in other words, more people will be in jobs, so there is more income and there is more tax. Let me now explain to you some basic facts about the tax record of this government and its predecessors. This year, gross PAYE tax will provide 46.5% of our total tax. In the last year of the Fraser government, it provided 51%. Secondly, this year, excluding Medicare, total tax is 24.7% of gross domestic product. In the last year of the Fraser-Howard government, it was 25%. So it is the coalition parties that retain the distinction of being the highest tax parties in Australia's peacetime history. For social welfare beneficiaries, the government has moved in this budget to make substantial increases in payments. This is in sharp contrast to the record of the Fraser-Howard government, which failed to make any meaningful improvement to the level of pensions and benefits, even for those clearly in real need. For example, since the Labor government was elected, the pensions and benefits of a lone parent with, say, one child living in private rental accommodation has increased by $27.65 a week. That's an increase to an obviously needy section of the community of almost 27%. In this budget alone, further substantial increases have been made in benefits. One beneficiary who appeared on Nationwide last night complained that this budget had cheated her. In fact, someone in her situation, a sole parent, renting, with 3 children, is to receive an increase of $15.50 a week, or 10.8% from this budget. That reflects our budget aim of targeting assistance to those most in need, particularly renters and those with children. Those are a very substantial increase in living standards in real terms. By the end of 1984, it is estimated that the Consumer Price Index will have increased by less than 9% since the last election. Clearly, the 3 million plus Australians reliant on pensions and benefits, and the further 250,000 Australians who have found jobs under this government, have benefited from an unambiguous improvement in their living standards. And the needy groups in our society also stand to benefit from the continued economic growth promised by this budget. The single most effective thing, of course, any government can do to help alleviate poverty is to pursue policies that create jobs, for it is overwhelmingly clear that unemployment is a prime cause of hardship for many Australians. For other needy groups in our society, strong employment growth, by relieving the burden on the social security system, enhances the ability of the government to increase the level of assistance to them. That is exactly what we did in last night's budget. And the government sees its 1984-5 tax cuts as assisting in securing economic growth that this year and in future will make further increases in assistance possible. Mr. President, of course, the opposition have reacted predictably and attacked what we've done in this budget. In particular, they claim to be concerned about the level of the deficit. They accuse this government of being a big spender, of being unconcerned about the impact of its decisions on financial markets. But at the same time, they object to every decision we've taken in order to reduce the longer-term structural deficit. Mr. Peacock says he will scrap our new superannuation tax arrangements. He was opposed to the reintroduction of the incomes test for the over 70s, and he's opposed to the assets test. He has constantly attacked us for removing his inequitable subsidy for wealthy home buyers. He is promising to abolish the new oil levy, introduce a rebate for dividends, build a railway to Darwin, raise the threshold tax rate for income splitters, and recreating the bicentennial water resources program. You might remember the one Mr. Fraser was hatching up last January 1983 for his forthcoming election. Now he is also promising not only to retain the investment allowance, but he's going to increase it to 20%. And he says he'll abolish the new wine tax, even though it is by far the lowest rate of tax applying to any alcoholic drink and only half the rate applying to soft drink. The total annual cost of the commitments I have listed approaches $2.5 billion, plus another $1 billion for the railway. And that is still not a full list of the coalition promises. These commitments, of course, represent sensational largesse. A 20% investment allowance alone would cost about $600 million in government revenue foregone per year, with this cost rising to approach $1,000 million per year by the end of the decade. That very substantial cost would be on top of the cost of the new accelerated depreciation provisions, which are expected to cost almost $2,000 million in 1989-90. I just might dwell on the fact that the 5/3 depreciation last year cost $20 million, this year projected to cost $100 million, $1,000 million by 1987 and $2,000 million by 1990, but Mr Peacock wants to add another $1,000 million into that to just erode the company tax base even further. These sort of figures expose his economic statements for what they are, sheer nonsense. He constantly claims he will act to cut the deficit, but he has opposed virtually everything which the government has done to reduce the out-year costs of programs. The reality is he has given no serious thought to the economic problems this country faces. He has in no way attempted to participate in a genuine debate about this nation's economic future. Instead, he has gone for the cheap electoral plaudit every time. It is this government that has been prepared to make the hard decisions that might be politically unpopular in the short term, but will stand Australia in good stead in the longer term. It has been the Labor government that has got Commonwealth spending back under control after the $9.6 billion legacy of Mr Howard. It has been this government that has, for the first time in Australia's history, got the states together to voluntarily agree to limit their borrowings. It has been this government that has reduced the Commonwealth deficit by $1,200 million this year, following a similar cut in the prospective deficit last year. We've also reduced the domestic deficit by $1,600 million, $1.6 billion. Those achievements add up to a forecast reduction in the public sector borrowing requirement of around 1%, from 8% of gross domestic product in 1983-4 to around 7% in 1984-5. And Mr President, that's a very substantial and important achievement, for it has been made and has made a very substantial contribution towards creating the conditions necessary for interest rate falls, some of which of course we've already seen. Those are the factors which will combine to produce the lasting growth that this country needs in order to further reduce unemployment. Now, the opposition have had their chance. They spent the best part of a decade in power, yet they left behind them double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. This government has already made substantial progress towards reducing both those scourges. And with the budget I introduced last night, we, together with all the people of Australia, will continue to make progress. Mr President and members of the club, thank you for allowing me to speak to you today.
Thank you very much, Treasurer. I'm very pleased that you were able to prune a little of your speech in view of the constraints on time today, which I remind our questioners in the media group of. Again, as they begin, the first question today is from Prue Guard.
Mr Keating, Prue Guard from PM. Despite the predicted fall in public sector borrowing to 7% this year, it is still, as is the deficit, high by Australian standards. What strategies do you have left to reduce our still high interest rates, which I gather is necessary for recovery, given that a low deficit no longer seems to be your option?
Well, I just completely reject the proposition that a low deficit is not our option. The lowest possible deficit is our option, and I think we have, if you look at, we started with a prospective deficit of $9.6 billion in March 1983. We're now looking at 6.7 for this budget, and a domestic deficit of even less than that. So in terms of reductions in the deficit, you might also recall that the Loan Council outcome was indeed an historic outcome. For the first time in a long time, we got the states back under some sort of global agreement about the size of borrowings. That is, the true purpose of the Loan Council has been restored. And for that, you recall, we gave the states much greater freedom to act within those limits. But that reduction meant that we kept the states in the same money, not the same real money, but the same money for 83-4. And whatever reduction is now possible off the Commonwealth deficit will be translated absolutely off the public sector borrowing requirement. Now, Prue, we've already seen substantial falls in interest rates. Let me remind you that the 180-day bill rate in March 1983 was just under 16%. It's now 11%, 5% lower. And bonds on the long end and secondary market trading and in tenders have declined as well. So we're getting the falls in interest rates, but of course what gives the market much greater confidence about those falls is the rapid downward trend in inflation and the fact that the government has an incomes policy in place nailing it there. Now, you get a choice, and that is you could have had a lower deficit but no tax cut, as John Howard suggested he would have had. Now, I reject that because the tax cut supports the accord, adds to consumption and will keep inflation down. And it is the inflation coming down, the underlying rate of inflation coming down, and the fact that the government is reducing the deficit as fast as it possibly can, but keeping a policy to reduce inflation in place, which is leading confidence on financial markets, and also with a believable monetary policy, which of course we brought in on target for the first time in 5 years. So they're all the factors which are affecting interest rates, and I don't accept the underlying thesis which you put, and that is because we've not been able to reduce it below 6.7 billion, we won't see further falls in interest rates.
Robert Hawke.
Mr Treasurer, Robert Hawke, National 9 Network. If the recovery is as strong as you say it will be, why is government spending a new record as a proportion of gross national product higher than in any year in the Fraser-Howard government, and higher, to anticipate the point that you will make about Medicare, than in any Whitlam year when the government was financing Medibank?
Well, look, I just can't recall the Whitlam statistics, but let me just make this point. We've got growth in outlays this year at 6.1% real. If you deduct the Medicare increase, which is about 2.2 percentage points of that, you bring it back to 3.9. Now, you have public debt interest, which is again an outlay, but of course not a discretionary one as far as the government's been concerned. We are paying in this budget for the deficits of the coalition. We're paying to mop up capital inflow, which came in last year, which the whole community would require we do if we are to run a reasonable monetary policy. And of course we've got to finance the deficit for this coming year. Now that PDI, public debt interest, the growth in public debt interest accounts for 1.6 percentage points of that 6.1, which leaves the real increase in discretionary, or if you like more discretionary, because it's very hard to categorise these things in discretionary and non-discretionary, more discretionary at about 2.3%, which I think is a comparatively low figure considering the burden which the government has had rested upon its shoulders. I make the point, Robert, if you just leave public debt interest in there and take the 2.2 percentage points out for Medicare, you end up with 4.6%. You end up with 3.9%, which is below the 10-year average to 1983-4, which was 4.6%. So I think no matter where you look in terms of statistics, you do have, in terms of growth, discounting for Medicare, a fairly reasonable outcome. We would always like to keep those outlays better than they are. You've also got the other additional problem of outlays growth at a time of rapidly falling inflation reflecting directly in real increases when it takes indeed some of those indexes some time to adjust to the lower inflationary environment, and that's part of the problem this year. You might recall when the forward estimates came out, we were looking at 3.2%. Well, that rose as inflation fell, but we brought the budget in under the forward estimates figure, even with the new spending.
Warwick Boyd.
Warwick Beutler, ABC Public Affairs Programs. Mr Keating, in view of the fact that this is an election budget, can you say unequivocally that the average family is now better off in terms of its standard of living than when you took office, and if so, by how much?
Well, I can't just pull that figure off the top of my head, Warwick, for you, but I might try and do it this afternoon if you'll give me some forbearance. I reject absolutely your premise about the budget being designed for an election. Look, we made it quite clear, you understood the development of this accord, we made it quite clear to the unions, we are securing, amongst other things, the Medicare effect upon the consumer price index, which will mean no wage increase in award wages between April 1984 and April 1985. We promised tax cuts at the election, which we were unable to fulfil last year because of the disastrous inheritance left to us by John Howard and his colleagues with the $9.6 billion. And as well as that, you've got the general movement of inflation through the scales. Now, all of that came up to a tax increase which had to be met with a tax cut, and that tax cut was a central part not only of stimulating consumption in the economy but also underpinning those price and incomes accord. It would have been there regardless of any timing consideration for an election. The second thing I say to you is the commitments we made to those poorer categories of social service beneficiaries and recipients is a commitment that I believe would have been in this budget regardless again of any proximity to an election. And the third tier of our objectives, reducing the budget deficit, is there to be seen. And so I reject the notion that we have designed this budget for an election. Let me just say this to you as well. There's been obviously substantial increases in family income. We've had indexation since March 1983, which has been worth about $25 a week to the average wage and salary earner. I might just mention, by the way, that Mr Peacock is on record saying he was opposed to wage indexation, and when he's throwing these rubbery figures of his around, he fails to mention that the workforce would be $25 a week worse off for not having indexed wages. And I might just also mention that when Mr Howard was asked about whether he would have a lower deficit or tax cuts, he said the lower deficit every time. So if you take them at their word, it means no indexation, no tax cut, but from this government you've seen indexation, the maintenance of wages, a tax cut, and as well as that, substantial improvements in benefits, Medicare. In terms of what is called the social wage, I think the vast majority of wage and salary earners are very pleased by it.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan of The Age. Mr Keating, you've stressed in your speech that these tax cuts are real cuts, but in fact much of the cut is compensation for no tax indexation. Will your post-election review of taxation, tax structure, include consideration of reintroducing full tax indexation, and what is your personal view of the desirability or otherwise of automatic tax indexation?
Well, Michelle, I never even knew it was around. You could have fooled me. I never even knew it was around. But let me just let me make that point. The second point is this: that you are wrong in saying that this is simply a tax cut restoring indexation. Indexation would have cost $1.2 billion this year. The tax in a full year, $1.2 billion in a full year. The tax cut is worth $2.1 billion in a full year. So I mean, this debate we saw a little bit of last night about saying, well, you know, you've got this growth in revenue. Why don't you hand more of it back? I mean, what you're talking about is the growth in revenue coming through the operation of inflation on the tax scales. That's $1.2 billion in a full year. We've handed back more than that. But the most important thing, I think, also needs to be understood. If we'd have simply indexed the scales, we would have indexed the rates at 46 and 60 cents, and the largest tax cuts would have gone to the 60% marginal taxpayers, the 46-cent marginal taxpayers, and it would have meant that somebody down around 15,000 would have got $2.30 a week instead of $7.60 a week. Now, that's what I call a Fraser-Howard type tax cut. Well, the Fraser-Howard type tax cut dragged back another $1.4 billion indirect taxes in the same budget. So this is a real tax cut, but it's not only a real tax cut, but it's directed down the lower end, so that the $7.60, in fact, travels right through from $12,500 to $28,000. You would have seen a couple of dollars only down those bottom ranges, and you would have seen tremendous increases for people in the over 60% area, where, of course, most of you people would reside, including myself. Now, I think in terms of backing self-interest in, that's taking it to crazy extremes in terms of any government which is trying to get equity back in the tax system. Well, let me just raise one of the points you raised. Someone was saying we're fiddling at the edges with tax reform and restructuring the tax scales. There are now 5 steps in there. There's There was once a 30% step from the threshold up to 19,500. There's now a 25% step from the threshold to 12,500, and there's a 30% rate then from 12,500 to 19,500. You then, under the old scale, went from 46 cents at 19,500 through to 35,788. We've now got another rate at 48% in there at 28,000. So it is a major restructuring of the tax scale. Let's not haggle about fiddling at the edges. It's a major restructuring of the tax scale. It's much more progressive. It is decidedly more progressive than it was when we began.
Greg Howard.
Greg Howard, the Financial Review. Mr Keating. Addressing businessmen soon after delivering last year's budget, you committed the government to tackling the structural element of the budget as the economy grew. As you said in your budget speech last night, growth last financial year was 10%, which was the best performance in 25 years. Yet it would seem that this budget only marginally, if at all, dealt with the structural element. Indeed, outlays as a proportion of GDP will grow. Do you stand by your commitment made last year? And if so, how will you deliver it?
Well, in the end, Greg, the only way that any government will deal with these budget deficits will be simply through the question of growth and at the same time trying to exercise savings and outlays. Now, last year, you might recall, we made savings of 1.2 billion and 600 million in tax expenditures. That was 1.8. This year, we'll make savings of the order of about 600 million, right? Now, that's over 2.5 billion or near 2.5 billion in the two budgets. You might recall the Razor Gang of the middle 70s dallying around for nearly a year to find 500 million, which finally dwindled to 250 million. Now, we've made savings here of about 2.5 billion. And I'll just say this to you, the days of easy savings are over. All this stuff that Malcolm Fraser was doing, that is dropping off maintenance of Commonwealth buildings and these sort of easy things, the fact is one of the first bills we picked up in government was a $250 million increase on maintenance of Commonwealth property, which is falling to pieces. So they've got to be genuine savings, and essentially that means attacking programs and attacking large programs, and we did that. The over 70s, the superannuation, all of those things, the assets test, are all structural savings. Indeed, the indexation of excises was a structural measure, as indeed are some of the measures such as the wine tax, which we introduced last night. This budget is the structural, I mean, we didn't do a structural cyclical breakdown this budget, but it would be, I think, a little lower in terms of the structural deficit than it would have been. Obviously, the cyclical part of the stretches, the deficit is lower as the economy is now reacting on the budget rather than the budget reacting on the economy. The growth is actually pushing the cyclical part back. But we won't ever really pull it back without growth and without a determined effort on the part of the government to affect savings programs, and that means getting away from some of the bunkum Mr Peacock's trafficking in, that is running around saying you can have bigger outlays, bigger tax cuts and smaller deficits. Now, that sort of rubbish just shouldn't be permitted to be trafficked anywhere, and I will guarantee you we'll be giving him a nice hammering over that and as the next day or two goes on. Now, I'm conscious of the structural deficit, but at the same time, if we were to pull it back dramatically, we would pull aggregate activity out of the economy. Now, you remember this, it's all right luxuriating now, 18 months on, saying, well, let's have, what about reform of the tax system? What are we doing about the structural deficit? When I stood up here a year ago, there was no hope in this country. There was nothing. I mean, we had the first negative growth for 30 years. You had inflation at 11.5% when the rest of the world was at 3 and 4. You had an extra 250,000 unemployed. You had business profits falling apart. Look at what you've got today. You've got the highest growth in the OECD countries for 83.4. You've got strong employment growth, 260,000 extra jobs. You've got inflation running at 5%, thereabouts. I would have thought that any notion now of ripping the structural deficit back simply to get interest rates effects when the economy is really still developing its strength out of that hole would be very silly indeed. And I think we've got the right mix of structural, cyclical balance in the deficit. and I think business thinks that well. In fact, the business reaction to this budget has been very, very good, and we're very pleased by it.
Tony O'Leary.
Treasurer Tony O'Leary from the Sydney Sun. Treasurer, you keep reminding us of the alleged deception of the coalition parties before the last election in relation to the 9.6 billion deficit. I was wondering whether the Labor Party intended to release the latest estimates of the structural deficit before the next federal election.
Tony, as a front page writer for the Sydney Sun, you're not going to be lecturing me about deceptions, are you? I would have thought, I thought you and I have been working in different parliament buildings over the last couple of years and sometimes, and I just want to say this about the deficits, and it is this, that Mr Howard is now taking to himself the growth and the confidence and the cyclical return of revenues to the Commonwealth that have occurred under this government as though that was the no policy starting point for his prospective deficit. Now that is nonsense. It wasn't. The 9.6 was a real figure. The 9.6 eventually became 9 billion. But it became 9 billion because of what we believe were better expectational effects in the economy when modelling those growth assumptions through and return of receipts on the basis of what this government had put together after the summit processes were over and we were well on the way down of the operation of our accord with the ACTU. So I don't accept that for a moment we have been in the slightest way deceptive about the deficit. The no policy change start, which Mr Howard left us, was 9.6 billion. When we finally got to the wire, it was 9, and we brought it in at 7.9. I mean, that should not be forgotten. We brought Mr Howard's prospective 9.6 deficit in at 7.9, and we've reduced that by 1.2. So at 6.7, we're almost 3 billion under the disastrous fiscal inheritance he left us. As I said in the minute the Secretary of the Treasury gave me the day I took office, that the fiscal deterioration in Australia was unparalleled in Australia's history and the history of Western economies. That was the disastrous inheritance of Mr Howard, and the fact of the matter is we went to the poll believing it was $6 billion, and he'll have to carry that stigma as long as he's in politics.
Paul Ellerkamp.
Paul Ellerkamp from the Australian Treasurer. Treasurer, the government places a lot of store in wage restraint through wage indexation as underpinning conditions for economic recovery. Yet the budget statements, budget statement number 1 argues that there needs to be greater flexibility in the wages system, and it says, and I quote, "The challenge will be to devise and implement adjustments to the system that allow for greater flexibility in relativities without precipitating an acceleration in the overall level of labour costs in Australia such as we've seen in the past." End of quote. How would you achieve a greater flexibility in the wages system? Can the present system of full wage indexation facilitate the greatest advantage being taken of economic recovery indefinitely? And does the current talk of trading off productivity-based wage increases next year for superannuation benefits reflect a belief that the economy can't safely bear the full direct wage rises to which workers might feel entitled?
Well, let me take the last part of the question first, Paul. I mean, there seems to be a view about that it is an improper thing for the ACTU to be suggesting that on-costs ought to be considered as part of the total approach to the operation of the Accord. Now, I would have thought that was the very essence of the Accord, that not only was it about wages, but if we did something on the basis of on-costs, that itself was an integral part of those considerations. And to have the ACTU talking about, for instance, trade-offs against productivity for changes in some conditions of employment is, I think, an entirely healthy development. The alternative is for them to mount a productivity case, snatch the money, and then, as a wage increase, and then talk about on-costs. Now, I don't think that's a healthy development, and therefore, getting back to the central point of your question, in terms of wage flexibility, we've got the British craft union structure of organisation in Australia. We don't have industry unions. We have unions which transcend the boundaries of industries. We've had a very rigid, centralised wage fixation structure. We've always had it. The Fraser government was not able to be rid of it, and when it tried its experiment with so-called marketplace wage determination, in the presence of, with the operation of that union structure and that centralised structure, the result was that the winnings of the strongest unions drifted through the system to the weakest unions, and the result was we had more unemployment and comfort for those in employment. Now, I think the only way you'll ever get that sort of flexibility in this country at the moment, with the way in which our trade unions are structured and our wage fixation structured, is the cooperative relationship we have with the ACTU. In the end, you've got to talk about it. And surely we're not at the point anymore where anyone in this country believes that you can operate a monetary policy, tighten up credit, push up interest rates and lift unemployment with any hope of depressing wage movements. I mean, it didn't happen. We gave it a very good try. We gave it a 5 or 6 year try and it failed. Now, we're not having a bar of it, and any flexibility we'll have will be the flexibility we have in our dealings in our cooperative growing relationship with the ACTU.
Mr Treasurer, I'm sorry that we've run out of time. I apologise also to those who were still hoping to ask questions, but another and larger group of questioners awaits you at Parliament House. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you also to your wife, Anita, for joining us. In this particularly gruelling period of engagement around the budget, we know how difficult it is, and we join in thanking you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you, Ken. Could I just thank the audience for being attentive, for the intelligent questions, and I hope I'll be back many more times.